Will begin in 5 minutes. We ask that you Our program will begin in 5 minutes. We ask that you silence your mobile devices at this time. Our program will begin in 5 minutes. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed the food and conversation during our luncheon session. To start our afternoon program, please welcome to the stage TD Securities Head of Inclusion and Diversity, Reepa Rashid.
Anything goes when we ride. When we ride. Even with my little shorty by my side. The long tongue, no bugger now. Burn up, pop up, and hit them by some pride. Move when I say freeze. Because we not afraid we pop up and squeeze. Both you are bar, I make man feel.
Right. Welcome, everybody. How's everyone doing? Good? Lots of coffee for the afternoon? Yeah? Well, I am delighted to be here. My name is Reepa Rashid. I head up inclusion and diversity for TD Securities, which is TD Bank's global investment bank. I am delighted to be the moderator this afternoon of our Chief Diversity Officer panel. So without further ado, I'd like to invite my three Chief Diversity Officer colleagues onto the stage. Can I have Anne Anaya from Sencora? Next, we have Erica Irish Brown from Citi. And last but not least, we have Melanie Parker from Google. Please join me, ladies. How's everyone doing today?
Good.
Well, we have a really rich conversation coming up over the next hour about our roles as heads of diversity and inclusion and other things. Erica, in addition to being Chief Diversity Officer, is also head of global talent. And, I know you are diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, Google, your role and the work you do spans so many elements. So I think before we go into what it's like to deal with diversity and inclusion at a leadership level in these volatile, complicated times, I want to get a little more personal with each of you. Can we start a little bit with how you got to your role, how you came to the diversity and inclusion work? I often talk to other women of color like ourselves, and we said, we were born to the diversity work, but how long have you done it for pay, and how did you get there? So maybe we start with you, Melanie, at this time around at that end, and we'll move over.
Oh, of course. I do think you make a good point, as contributors and consumers of the work, what draws you here. First, I want to let you know how I identify. My pronouns are she and her. And in addition to that, I'm a mom, a daughter. I'm now a Gigi. I have a 9-month-old granddaughter. So
Congratulations.
I've known love, but not this type of love before. So it is amazing in the grandma land. But I have been in this work throughout my career. So I have a career in human resources that spans not just the tech industry, but aerospace and defense, including our national laboratories. And I've always worked for not just diversity, equity, and inclusion, but for fairness, for dignity, for respect at the same time. And so it's where passion and purpose align with career and the opportunity to make lives better for other people.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Melanie. I think that's probably a common thread. Erica, your journey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I too am a mom, daughter. I have 3 boys. My mom turned 91 yesterday, so we are blessed. And I'm not, my whole career has not been in human resources. So I spent the first half of my career in investment banking. So very traditionally an analyst out of undergrad. I worked down in the Clinton administration, down at the Treasury, then went back to business school, then came out and I was an associate. So very, very common investment banking on the line track. But along the way, as you can imagine, starting on Wall Street over 30 years ago, and as a Black woman, I took on this additional role that we now call diversity, equity, inclusion. So whether or not it was helping with recruiting and what became diversity recruiting efforts, whether or not it was mentoring efforts along the way, and just telling people what little I knew more than them from the 1 year I was ahead of them or the 2 years I was ahead of them. I was committed to doing that and working with partner organizations like SEO, like Twigo, to make sure that we were increasing diversity in financial services. So about 17 years ago was when I switched into working in diversity, equity, inclusion full-time, and it has been the most rewarding part of my career to date, first starting in diversity recruiting functions, and now leading on diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as talent globally at Citi.
And Anne. Thank you, Erica.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Happy Hispanic Heritage Month to everyone.
Happy Hispanic Heritage Month.
So I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm a Mexican American, and my family immigrated from Mexico. Largely the migration to the Midwest was either railroad or working in the fields, sugar beet fields. When growing up in the Midwest, small town, largely white, I was the youngest of 3 kids, 2 older brothers in a highly machismo environment, and my dad would tell me that I'm always asking why and commenting that things aren't fair because I can't do what my brothers do. So generally, just growing up thinking about fairness, justice, seeing my brothers and my cousins being treated differently, whether it be in school or with regard to law enforcement. So eventually thinking about where in the world can you go where fairness is a must, and landing on this idea of going to law school and working toward justice, the idea of equality in a system. So I was a trial lawyer for 20 years, first as a public defender, and then a state district attorney, and then a federal prosecutor for the U.S. Department of Justice for 11 years. And through that process, learning this idea of how to create fairness with discretion, with advocacy, moving into corporate thereafter, 3M company, and developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion commitment and committee, and then standing up the first ever chief diversity officer role there. And then almost 2 years ago now, being recruited over to Cencora to be their first global chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. And I guess the idea here for me is wherever you are, whether it's a system of justice or in corporate and an industry, how can you contribute to this thing we call equity, equality? How can we create a more fair and just world? And diversity, equity, and inclusion work certainly is that. It's been the best career move of my career for sure.
Thank you. Thank you for all of your personal connections and stories to this. One thing I hope you've all picked up is that we really come from very different professions and backgrounds to this. Lawyer, MBA, analyst track. You come from advocacy, defense industry. I have an MBA, I'm an anthropologist. So that's one of the joys of being in this field, right? We learn, we're constant learners, and we learn from one another. It's an understatement to say, though, however long we've been in this field, the last 3 years have been marked by some seismic shifts. Painful, many. Not only George Floyd's murder, of course, where it started, but since then, the overturn of Roe versus Wade. We're going to talk a little bit about SCOTUS and affirmative action. But looking back, first let's talk about your roles. What's shifted in your roles? I mean, what's changed in the workplace and the way we do diversity and inclusion? Have some things become easier? Have some things become harder? I really open it up. Whoever wants to start on that question, because things have been different. We've all had to acquire different skill sets very rapidly, and we still are. So, Melanie, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I'll start. One of the first changes that I actually noticed was myself. So, and if we take a step back before the murder of George Floyd, like certainly with, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, like we know, like these aren't a series of episodic events that, led to the global racial equity movement, but, before that with COVID and the comorbidities that were highlighted particularly for, brown and black communities that exacerbated. So I think like if we take that shift, but for me personally, I had to take a step back and think about not code switching. Like many parts of my career, like I checked a part of myself at the door, I picked it up neatly at the end, went out, did my thing, but I couldn't lead in this critical or key inflection moment and do that. Like I had to reconcile like all parts of myself because
Melanie, can I ask, what were you code switching between what and what?
Yeah, so I was code switching between, being a black woman and operating in black culture with operating in a majority work culture and work environment. So thank you for bringing that out. But one of the things that I recognized was I couldn't have the voice across racial equity and code switch because for me personally, there were things that I actually had, I don't think I forgot them. I think they were just buried so deep that through racial equity work, through the murder of George Floyd, through watching all of that and experience it and speaking, there were things that came up for me that even surprised me, and I wanted to pour all of that into the work. And how does that relate to Google and the workplace? One of the things that it helped to do was to normalize talking openly about race.
Yes.
And certainly we talk about equity in addition to equality, but what does it mean to truly recognize that groups are situated differently and require a different treatment or a different approach that could go above and beyond? And so the deepening of the work to build sustainable solutions is what we've seen at Google, and that what we've seen really across the industry in a way that not just toggles between the hyper-visible and the invisible, but normalizes the experiences so that we truly address systemic and structural obstacles that have long been in place. And so that's what, I've personally gone through and what we've seen across the workplace and certainly across the tech industry as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you say that the personal toll it often took. Erica and I actually partner in a lot of networks of chief diversity officers, and I remember, particularly in the first 18 months post George Floyd's murder, how much of a personal toll it took on a lot of our colleagues, and I think our work does have that personal piece to it. So thank you for sharing that. I hate to go all the way around, so maybe I'll switch gears and go to Anne for a moment before we come back to you. We'll mix it up a little bit. And your thoughts on kind of how things have shifted. You've been at Cencora for 2 years, you said? Okay. So in your prior role, this role, talk to us.
So I think agree with all that has been said on the racial equity front. I also think that there is a shift in the industry with how we think about DEI as a strategy for growth and innovation. So aligning it to the corporate social responsibility of environment, social, and governance. And that really has been an evolution where you kind of started with grassroots employee resource groups, maybe extensions of listening like lean-in circles from a women's perspective, but still very US-centric. And then once we started talking about inclusion, it really became a conversation about culture. So more moving away from the grassroots to a culture and aligned to a strategy where you're putting together a purpose behind the community. And then now that equity is a part of it, thinking about pay equity, thinking about responsibility from a global perspective for women's rights, civil rights, the underserved, and marginalized. We include immigrant populations from around the globe, broadening the conversation of the LGBT community and people with different abilities, and really thinking about this much more holistically, having the science and the research to say, diversity, equity, and inclusion is an imperative, a business imperative, where if you want to think of your positioning for the future, this is a must-have to thread through all that you do. So I do think that in a relatively short distance of time, diversity, equity, and inclusion has grown into a very specific strategy, starting out much more grassroots and moving into the corporate function perspective, and now threading through the business strategy.
Yeah, I want to just bottle up everything all of you are saying. It's the Chief Diversity Officer playbook right here, everybody. I do want to kind of segue to Erica with one comment. I love that you are both head of diversity and head of talent, because one of the things that is becoming apparent is we all know the year 2045, what's going to happen, right? It's when this term minority-majority is going to be irrelevant in this nation. And so most talent pools are going to be quote-unquote diverse. So Erica, going back to the original question, how's your role shifted? Obviously, it's shifted in this way, but tell us a little more about the city perspective and your role.
Yeah, what I would add to what's already been said is a few things. I think personally, I've been willing to storytell. Mm-hmm. And share my lived experiences in a different way and in a way that's relevant to the work. I think that's true of a lot of diverse senior executives that would not have necessarily shared in that way before, because they felt like they had an audience that actually was prepared to listen for a change. And I think that the art of listening and senior leaders listening when on topics that they really did not know anything about and had to acknowledge that was also something that shifted. So it wasn't just people thinking that they knew how to solve this problem immediately, but rather listen and let's talk about this and work about it together. So I think that that's one thing that I would say has really shifted over time. It's become more of a two-way dialogue. And, and that employees do have more of a voice. So even that paradigm has shifted in terms of who had the power between employees and employers. So I thought that that was a good shift. And even, we can't not acknowledge the shift of the workforce and them working from home because of COVID. And also having to actually acknowledge racism, and not just Black racism, because we had the whole anti-Asian sentiment going on at the same time. So even just the public acknowledgement of racism, I know it sounds silly, but people acted like it didn't exist, and they weren't prepared to really acknowledge it in the same way as, they did from COVID to George Floyd. So I do think that that just shifted the dialogue and created a space where actually firms really focused on racial equity and even set goals around racial equity versus a blanket people of color and or not acknowledging racism. The other thing I think that did was also elevate the visibility of the work and take the work a lot closer to the executive management team's accountability, not just responsibility, but accountability, as well as the boards really wanting to understand, what was the plan, what's the commitment, what's the accountability around it. So you had board engagement, you had executive management team engagement, as well as investors engaging around it. So I think it just took the dialogue to different places and spaces and really reaffirmed that this is core to the business and core to the firm's values. And I think that especially at a time when employees were at risk, whether or not it was health, whether or not it was quiet quitting, whether or not all the different things that were happening with the employee base, I think the firms that did the most actually managed to really engage their employees, retain their employees, and even keep them connected to the company at a time when they were not physically in the office. So, and I think that perspective and even the role that diversity, equity, inclusion played in return to office became a critical role, right? And that's before you even get into everything that shifted around the focus on mental health and resiliency, and then Gen Z coming into the workforce at the same time. So I'll stop, but it's like
I told you this is the full playbook.
The continuum is really.
Well, can I just, and please, Melanie and Ann, if you want to comment on anything, I want this to be a conversation. If that's something that Erica said you want to piggyback off of, let me know, and we'll, please interrupt me. I do want to piggyback, just double click on one thing you said about storytelling and kind of our identity. I love that you shared that you're a grandmother, and we all shared some pieces of our personal history. I found that a really powerful piece. What do we have to say to our audience who are not in leadership roles about being more authentic? Because I feel like when I was younger in my career, I had that whole hyper professionalism. I had to blend in, and the fact that I'm Muslim, the fact that I'm an immigrant, the fact that I'm South Asian, all of these things. We all now know that diversity is our superpower, and everyone's experience is different in the workplace, and it's that creates the better whole. But that was not easy to do when you're earlier in your career. Any kind of advice on storytelling and that? Because I love that piece and how people listen more now.
I didn't always know that diversity was a superpower. When I came into the workplace, I was taught that I had to fit in. And so that didn't let me know if I had to fit in a place, it didn't let me know that all the special things that were unique about me and my identity, were certainly superpowers. And I believe that there's a shift here. And it's really looking at what's additive, not just what fits. So as an example, at Google, we now have culture ad training. So as part of our inclusive hiring, we've trained over 10,000 managers in culture ad and how to look for, like, what's missing and what's additive. And I think how we respond, and what I would say to everybody is, you do bring a superpower, and how do you leverage that superpower? How are you crystal clear about what your unique skills and lived experiences bring that are additive to a product, to a service, to a culture, to a team, and how do you express that? And I think that's such a positive shift that's happened, certainly since we've all started deepening our commitment post the tragic murder of George Floyd, but I saw that shift even a little bit before that. So that's what I would add.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I think what's really important, whether or not you're a manager or anybody else, is that team dynamic. So one of the things, especially when I was running diversity recruiting functions, I used to ask leaders to focus on was best team, right? Like, everybody can't be the first baseman. Everybody can't be the quarterback, right? You need all types of skills, backgrounds, perspectives on the teams. And I think that that's one thing that's important. And for you to establish, what role you would play on that team and how you bring value to the team. The other thing that I would say that I would get leaders to focus on is also important to demonstrate your potential. So we look at potential quite a bit in the talent space, as you can imagine. But when you think about potential, ambition, as well as learning agility and the traits that make people successful, that's also what you can bring in your own, unique way. So, being additive to the team, I think, is such a critical point that a lot of people just think, like, oh, I'm just going to act like the same person on the team. Well, they already have a first baseman or whatever. Sorry, this microphone is making me crazy. It is making me crazy. I can't even think. Sorry. But that's the thing that I think people lose. The last thing I'll say is that a lot of people say, oh, bring your whole self to work. I always talk about bringing your authentic self to work, right? There's time and place for everything. And I think that's important to say as well, because you should always be able to be your authentic self. And I would even be so bold to say, if you don't feel like you can be your authentic self, that may not be the right place for you to thrive. But being authentic in a professional environment still has a definition to it. And I think a lot of times people confuse authenticity and bringing your authentic self to work with, that concept of wholeness and being anywhere, doing anything, right? Which I think is also, that I think can get into the bad advice space personally.
Yeah, interesting. But I do think that COVID and seeing people's pets and children on Zoom calls really did kind of test the lines of whole versus authentic.
I completely agree, because it's like, before that, we weren't invited to everybody's homes. And now we've all been invited into everyone's homes. They've invited to our homes, or the parts of those that we chose to show virtually. But we've also watched children grow up.
Yep.
We've watched favorite pets.
Yeah.
And so it gives us a frame even deeper to talk about, like,
Ourselves.
How's your child, or what's happening, or, you can go back to that. So I think we've all gotten a lot more personal, through that invitation of sorts.
Yeah, and we spend so much time at work. To have that is much less exhausting, right? To be able to be yourself. And did you want to add a little more? I saw you nodding.
I agree with everything that was said. I think, the realization that you can be vulnerable. Sometimes it takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable, but it shows leadership. And, very good point that, you can't bring all things into a business space. But, we all have a light, whatever that light is, set of skills, uniqueness, whoever we are, and let that light shine. Sometimes that means being vulnerable, having the courage to do that, find a place where you can do that, because that's when you're really going to be able to, as you said, thrive and live up to your purpose. So I think that's part of the storytelling.
Yeah.
If the storytelling is about showing people who you really are through stories, by sharing, there's a little bit of vulnerability in that, and that's why it's so powerful.
It is, yeah. I guess it has to be calibrated and curated to the audience, right? In a way. I'm going to switch gears now because I would have loved to continue this for longer. That could be a whole talk show ourselves, right? The storytelling piece. That's next year, maybe, right? But I want to switch to something that really shook our industry this year, the SCOTUS overturn of affirmative action. There was a lot of mythology and hand-wringing around, oh, this is the death knell for diversity and inclusion in corporate America. We in this space know that that's not the case. So I would love to hear from you how you have addressed the affirmative action overturned by SCOTUS, which impacted just a small sector of our society, namely part of higher education. But how have you addressed that? How have you helped demystify the mythology around how this is, the end of diversity and inclusion as we know it?
I can start if you
Sure,
like.
go for it. And
So, this is something that has built up over time.
Yeah.
So, inside of the field, you saw this coming for a number of years with the Harvard case and the activism around creating a case. But how we've addressed it is we've addressed it by educating, because this is a very
exactly.
narrow decision with
I'm glad you as the lawyer are starting to.
a narrow decision that's carving out space for taking into account background of race and ethnicity and experiences. So it's also true that many companies are government contractors in the U.S. and, of course, government contractors are obligated to be equal employment opportunity places. And how you make that come to pass is you actually look at representation internally and externally and find out whether or not you're getting your fair share of great talent. So there are protected classes. Race and ethnicity is one of them. And making sure that you're doing what you can to get that talent, retain that talent, develop that talent, is part of the obligation of doing business with the U.S. government. So the decision itself hasn't impacted equal employment opportunity. It hasn't impacted corporations. It's a narrow decision about admissions into colleges. And even with that, there's a carve out by our Chief Justice that, you can take into account these things that create the whole person, which include race and ethnicity.
Yep, and colleges are also creating all kinds of workarounds around this because they know diversity creates innovation and better ideas, right? And that's why we wake up and go to work every day, right? So Erica, your thoughts, and City obviously has been very upfront about this.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that it's business as usual for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we continue to do the work that we've been doing to work towards the goals that we've set for ourselves that are aspirational in nature. And I think even more than, a message saying, oh, business as usual, it's the work that needs to be done.
Right.
So, I think that I don't think that this will be the last that we hear of it, right? So I'm not naive in that way. And to Anne's point, nobody was surprised when the ruling came out as it did. and it's not going to be the last, right? It wasn't the first either, in terms of just a string of things that are happening, and how there are people out there that want to demonize, make DEI a dirty word, and misuse the word woke and everything else, right, to their benefit. And I think that will continue, and we'll have to continue our work knowing that that will continue. And I think the only thing that we have to be thoughtful about is how we make sure that we don't make our firms active targets, so that we don't get distracted defending the work versus doing the work.
Yeah, and our work isn't just recruiting, it's inclusion, it's debiasing, it's systemic shifts. So I think it's a lot of education that needs to continue to be done in the public domain. Melanie, I know you have a lot to say to us.
Well, at Google, we're very clear that diversity and inclusion are core values, core to our business, core to our workforce, core to the culture that we have. And we were one of nearly 70 companies that filed an amicus with the court to protect affirmative action programs. We set company-wide goals, and so we're like 60% of the way through 5-year goals, both at the company level as well as our racial equity goals. We continue to report our progress out quarterly. We just published our 10th annual diversity report, and we are an affirmative action employer. We have over 70 affirmative action plans, so we're very clear on our obligation, but not just the intent of what the law says, but the spirit of what the law says, because it makes us better and creates a better environment for our creators, our users, as well as those that work at Google.
Well, I actually want to just laud you all, because we need to be repeating, we need to be redoubling our commitment, I think, as large organizations. You represent some of the most important industries in this country, so your voices matter, right? Technology, finance, pharmaceuticals. These are the biggest, these are the drivers of the engine. So thank you for that. I'm going to kind of shift gears once more now, away from the legal terrain, to something a little more positive, which is, what have you, each of you are running complex organizations and initiatives and programs in your roles. Is there one or two things that you can share with this group that stands out in your mind as like a great success that other organizations can learn from? What would you say is something that was a win? Because, we're often sometimes a little gloom and doom in this space. So I wanted what are you hopeful about? And what's lifted you that, wow, this is working? I'm so glad we do this.
There's so much to be proud of. I have tremendous hope. What we're facing right now doesn't give me pause, because history shows that we've been here before and we've overcome. And some of the things where we've actually made progress, we're just not hearing as much. So as an example, I think it was at the end of September, there was an article that released metrics that the article talked about, have we made progress with hiring people of color post the murder of George Floyd? And the answer was yes, and not just at lower levels as we've seen historically, but at all levels. And so there are many data points that show we are actually closing the gaps that we've designed to do. But some of the proudest work that I've done in my career, as well as at Google, has been our racial equity commitments, where our goal has been to build sustainable equity, both internally and externally. But our whole company galvanized on a 100-day sprint, which resulted in 8 racial equity commitments, 4 external, 4 internal, that had just an enterprise global impact on our products, our services, our creators, our users, as well as our workforce. And we have made strong progress and have already, met some of those goals in advance of 2025. And so, I tell everybody we exist to close gaps. And, my job is that, my hope is that I would get put out of business because we've normalized, our approaches in a way that we can move on to solve other problems.
Well, each of us probably uses Google 100 times a day. So is there anything the user would know that came out of some of that 100 days?
Absolutely. So if you think about maps,
Uh-huh.
look at the attributes on maps, like where you find minority-owned businesses. If you think about the LGBTQ community, what are LGBTQ friendly businesses as well? Certainly, if you look at those of you who have our Google Pixel, uses True Tone technology,
Yep.
so it recognizes skin colors
Yep.
across like the full hue and ensures that those pictures are rich and beautiful and robust. And so just the effort that we put into product inclusion is evident in automatic speech recognition. 2 weeks ago, we had an announcement where we announced that a partnership with Howard University looking at speech recognition for automatic speech technology, because we do know from our own research at Google as well as external research that understanding different dialects is really difficult. And so, we've continued to invest in ensuring that we're able to do that more readily and accessible. So just a
Incredible
few.
stuff.
I
As
think-
someone whose husband has an accent, I know that he is always misinterpreted, and not just by me. Okay. So,
I just wanted to pick up on the point of how you can embed this into the business, and the fact that it's not just, the human capital elements when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think, in our case, it's, the financial inclusion work, for example. It's doing businesses and investing in Black banks. It's, having impact investing funds for, Black, Hispanic, LGBTQ, disability-owned businesses, women-owned businesses. And, so I think also embedding it in the business makes a big difference. And having it aligned with the business, right? So that it's not just like one diversity team in the center that's doing it, but that it's aligned with the proper vertical across the firm. And it just becomes, when people talk about being woven into the business, it's really woven in. So I think that that's an important element, and I think that that's exciting. I also think it's exciting when I look across Wall Street. A lot of firms have had their most diverse MD classes. I know for the last 2 years, Citi has had the most diverse MD classes that we've ever promoted in history. So that's pretty exciting. So there's definitely accomplishments. And I think you can see the accomplishments because there's more transparency.
yes.
And like Melanie was talking about their annual report, we have an annual talent and diversity report. You see more and more grow over the years. And I think they become even more detailed. And even now, when you look at the documents that you have to file, whether or not it's your 10K or whatever, there's more human capital and diversity content that's in all the filings that we do, the proxy statements, et cetera. So the transparency is there for people to see as well, which I think is exciting to be able to showcase the work that we do, as well as share best practice across the industry. The last thing I'll share that I think really has popped more over the recent years that's exciting is the concept of allyship.
Yes.
And, people being everyday allies, earning those stripes every day, every week, every month, and really having a voice and using their voice on behalf of others. I think the other thing that's important is the recognition that we all can be allies.
Yes.
Right, so it sort of started out as the concept of allies to the LGBTQ+, or then there were male allies for women, male champions, and even the concept always seemed to be that the ally was the straight, white, able-bodied man, right? Versus creating a culture of allyship. And for whatever privilege you have, for whomever you are, wherever you sit in the organization, that you would be prepared to use it on behalf of others. So I do think that playbook around allyship has now been disseminated, and that really folks, even junior folks, are taking a page from that playbook and using it on behalf of others.
You know, you foreshadowed that was going to be my last question about allyship.
Oh,
No, but I love it because the redefinition of allyship as not just about power differentials or majority-minority dynamics to something we can all enact, critical. You get the last word, Anne,
Oh my gosh.
on this one because I think we have a minute left, right?
Oh my gosh, all in 1 minute. Okay.
On something that we can you want to highlight a
Yeah.
win, a big win, something exciting.
So, something that we, I think, are developing, still not quite 2 years in, is this alignment of DEI to the purpose of creating healthier futures. So, we're a healthcare services provider, and during the pandemic, so many underserved communities, so many Hispanic, Latino communities did not have access to the vaccine. So, we had our independent pharmacies, which are in communities, accessible to people, places where people can seek care where they could not in the past. So that access to healthcare, having access to that vaccine, is now expanding to other vaccinations, other healthcare services, right directly in the pharmacies. And when you think about pharmacy deserts, many of people in our community are in those pharmacy deserts, so how we can expand that access through our independent pharmacies is really going to be important. So proud of that, proud of, to the point of allyship, intersectionality with our employee resource groups. You know, a lot of us are a lot of things, and some of the things we're not, but all of us are working towards the same aim, which is to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. So banding together, you know, is so important, and moving in concert with each other to have a greater impact.
Wow. I think, the bottom line here is that we're welding DEI into all aspects of our business, right? And impacting our societies that way too. So I think that brings us to the end of the formal part of the Q&A with our wonderful panel. Can we give everyone a round of applause, please? Thank you, Melanie, Erica, and Anne. Again, sorry to be repetitive, but I wish I could have bottled it all up, but I think we taped it. I think we have a few minutes now for some questions from our audience, so fire away. I think we have some mics. And please introduce yourself, and if there's a particular person you want to ask the question to.
Hello, my name is John. I'm with the Walt Disney Company. My pronouns are he, him, his. You talked about legislation, SCOTUS, Roe v. Wade, but I'd be remiss if you didn't, would love your perspective on legislation around the LGBTQ plus community, around legislation around corporate trainings. We have proud to say some nefarious folks in government that really want to harm these groups, harm how we do our work. But there's a lot of folks that are scared in these particular states that this legislation is coming down. Would love to hear more about how you are standing up for your employees during this tough time.
I can start briefly. So we developed a decision-making process for taking positions on public affairs issues, emerging issues, civil rights issues, human rights issues, and part of the leadership of our employee resource groups are part of the decision-making process for what position we take. Now, sometimes, people aren't aware of all the various moving parts of the impact a decision will have. If you're in the healthcare distribution industry and you take a position on reproductive rights, there are a lot of moving parts. You have to decide what position is best, not only for the employees, but also for the future of the company. The important part is that everyone's being a part of making that decision. So there's transparency in how you landed. One example.
Any other things to add on that? It's a really important question. Thank you.
Yeah, I would add, certainly we've supported we've joined different business groups that might be signing against certain legislation and/or amicus briefs or things of that nature. I think one of the other things that we've done is try to communicate with our employees openly and make sure that we're also checking in on our employees, because a lot of this is, hurtful even as you go through it. So that's something that we've done as well. But I think, again, this is happening. Every group is being attacked at some point of time, at some place. And so I think we are trying to be in the mode of how we openly support every group, use our ability to take a stand publicly, but even more, but not to be political. And that's one thing that I think is important to say, to not be involved with the politics, but really think about what it means for our people and what our people need. So, so away from the politics, I think, is an important point to make, because it's really about our people and making sure that we continue to have the support, services, engagement that we need to have. So even at one point, to use your example in the LGBTQ plus space, we actually have a service provider that specifically is aligned for counseling for the LGBTQ plus community, so that you're getting somebody that's sensitized to the topic and specifically engaging around how you identify and meet the needs of our people that way. So there are different examples of that depending on what country and what dimension of diversity, but I think it should always come down to the people first.
Thanks, Erica. And I think, external partners also matter here a lot, right? That's where we rely on organizations like HACER, like other partners, where we get their guidance on that non-political stance. Yeah. So great. Thank you for that question. I think we have one or two more.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh. My name is Lucre Ortiz. I'm a CEO in the YMCA. I'm also part of a disruptive group of CEOs in the Y. And we are examining our boards from a governance perspective and how they bring on people who have an equitable lens to influence governance, practice, and policy. So for us, it's not enough to diversify. We want the lens, and we want everyone on the board to understand it. So my question for you is, in your companies, how do you influence your board in their governance in terms of DEI, or externally sit on other boards and influence that way with your subject matter expertise?
So I can answer that. So at Google, we do have diverse representation on the board. So excited that Marty Chavez joined the Alphabet board last year, but I report to the Alphabet board quarterly. So I quarterly report on our progress. I share our learnings as well as the progresses that we've made, get their input. In terms of how we contribute to diversifying other boards, we do work with organizations to ensure we're putting underrepresented groups on boards, women, underrepresented minorities, so our employees participate with organizations that are looking to diversify external boards.
Yeah, and at Citi, I think it's important to say our board is 54% gender diverse, right? So it also has to start with your own board diversity and thinking about who are the leaders, and how are they influencing. And then, as a result, we also have a very diverse executive management team, and of course, the first woman CEO of a major global investment bank. So I think leadership, you can't just talk the talk, you also have to role model the diversity in your senior leadership, and that's something that we're doing. And then what I'm super excited about is that, in leading talent and all of succession planning for the org, we continue to have a diverse pipeline of senior leaders that go up to the top. But, the board, of course, sets the ultimate tone. So for us, that's the primary focus. And I do meet with the board, I would say about 6 times a year. And sometimes it's committee, sometimes it's the full board. But, so once a year is a full full, diversity presentation, a full talent presentation, and then committee meetings in between or certain subjects that we bring to the board on diversity, on talent. So it just sort of depends on the calendar, but my guess for the 2.5 years I've been at City, it's sort of never been less than 6 times a year.
I just have one thing to add, which is, in addition to quarterly reports to the board, what you're transparent about for shareholders, for a publicly traded company, what you're reporting out to the SEC, that transparency is what the board cares about. So making sure that the transparency is both with the board and with investors.
Yeah, and the SEC is actually really stepping up its game around diversity and inclusion, metrics, tracking initiatives, all of it. And the board piece, what you said, Erica, about diversity on the board itself is critical. I think it's a real bright spot in the diversity and inclusion world that we've actually seen board diversity go up significantly in the last 5 to 10 years in ways other metrics have been slower to move.
Yeah.
That one's moved. So thank you for that question. I think we have time for one more, a quick one.
Hi, my name is Glegma Cologne, and I'm part of the Diversity, Equity, and Culture team at NASDAQ. I do want to place focus on the importance of sponsorship, mentorship programs. As all these woke companies are coming out and the term, how do we still protect those programs that are taking our people to the next level without really losing focus on why they were created?
So to understand the question, do you mean these are sponsorship programs
The
specifically
sponsorship
for diverse?
for diverse, specifically for diverse, with affirmative action, they're being open more and losing sight of what race or ethnicity or group of people we created these programs for.
So I can start. So we have a number of sponsorship programs at Google that are aimed to, towards ensuring that women progress. As we think about like racially diverse, that we're able to do that as well. That's actually in context with our affirmative action efforts to proactively ensure that we have parity as we think about like representation at senior and executive levels. And so that's certainly legally compliant, as we talked about before with the SCOTUS decision. So I think what you bring up, though, is how are we all educated on what it means to take affirmative efforts and, and what that obligation is for corporate America so that we continue to invest, develop, and protect, to use your words, these critical programs.
Great. I think thank you for that question. I think with that, we are ready to close out this session. Thank you for being a fantastic audience. Let's give our speakers another round.